The House of Medici was an Italian banking family, political dynasty and later royal house that first began to gather prominence under Cosimo de' Medici in the Republic of Florence during the first half of the 15th century. The family originated in the Mugello region of the Tuscan countryside, gradually rising until they were able to fund the Medici Bank. The bank was the largest in Europe during the 15th century, seeing the Medici gain political power in Florence, though officially they remained citizens rather than monarchs. The Medici produced three popes of the Catholic Church: Pope Leo X, Pope Clement VII, and Pope Leo XI, two regent queens of France, Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici, and, in 1531, the family became hereditary Dukes of Florence. In 1569, the duchy was elevated to a Grand Duchy after territorial expansion. They ruled the Grand Duchy of Tuscany from its inception until 1737, with the death of Gian Gaston de' Medici. The Grand Duchy witnessed degrees of economic growth under the earlier Grand Dukes, but by the time of Cosimo III de' Medici, Tuscany was fiscally bankrupt. The wealth and influence initially derived from the textile trade guided by the Guild of the Art della Lana. Like other Signor families, they dominated the city's government. They were able to bring Florence under the family's power, and they created an environment where art and humanism could flourish. They, along with other families of Italy, such as the Visconti and Sforza of Milan, the Este of Ferrara, and the Gonzaga of Mantua, fostered and inspired the birth of the Italian Renaissance. The Medici Bank was one of the most prosperous and most respected institutions in Europe. There are some estimates that the Medici family were the wealthiest family in Europe for a time. For this base, they acquired political power initially in Florence and later in wider Italy and Europe. A notable contribution to the profession of accounting was the improvement of the general ledger system through the development of the double-entry bookkeeping system for tracking credits and debits. The Medici family were among the earliest businesses to use the system. History. Origins. The Medici family came from the agricultural Mugello region, north of Florence, being mentioned for the first time in a document of 1230. The origin of the name is uncertain. Medici is the plural of medico, also written del medico or del medico, meaning medical doctor. It has been suggested that the name derived from one Medico di Potrone, a castellan of Potrone in the late 11th century, who presumably was the family's ancestor. The dynasty began with the founding of the Medici Bank. Rise to power until the late 14th century. Prior to the Medici, the leading family of Florence was the House of Medici. In 1293 the Ordinances of Justice were enacted, which effectively became the constitution of the Republic of Florence throughout the Italian Renaissance. The city's numerous luxurious palazzi were becoming surrounded by townhouses built by the ever-prospering merchant class. In 1298, one of the leading banking families of Europe, the Bonsignoris, were bankrupted, so the city of Siena lost her status as the banking center of Europe to Florence. The main challenges of the Medici family were the Medicis, first under Giovanni de' Medici, later under his son Cosimo di Giovanni de' Medici and grandson Lorenzo de' Medici. The Medici controlled the Medici Bank, then Europe's largest bank, and an array of other enterprises in Florence and elsewhere. In 1433, the Medici managed to have Cosimo exiled. The next year, however, a pro-Medici Signoria was elected and Cosimo returned. The Medici became the city's leading family, a position they would hold for the next 3 centuries. Florence remained a republic until 1537, traditionally marking the end of the High Renaissance in Florence. But the instruments of republican government were firmly under the control of the Medici and their allies, save during intervals rivals after 1494 and 1527. Cosimo and Lorenzo rarely held official posts, but were the unquestioned leaders. The Medici family was connected to most other elite families of the time through marriages of convenience, partnerships, or employment, so the family had a central position in the social network. Several families had systematic access to the rest of the elite families only through the Medici, perhaps similar to banking relationships. Some examples of these families include the Bardi, Salviati, Cavalcanti, and the Tornabuoni. This has been suggested as a reason for the rise of the Medici family. Members of the family rose to some prominence in the early 14th century in the wool trade, especially with France and Spain. Despite the presence of some Medici in the city's government institutions, they were still far less notable than other outstanding families such as the Albizzi of the Strozzi. One Silvestro de' Medici was Speaker of the Woolmakers' Guild during the Ciompi Revolt, and one Antonio was exiled from Florence in 1396. The involvement in another plot in 1400 caused all branches of the family to be banned from Florentine politics for 20 years, with the exception of two. One of those, Averardo de' Medici, originated the Medici dynasty. 15th century Averardo's son, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, increased the wealth of the family through his creation of the Medici Bank, and became one of the richest men in the city of Florence. Although he never held any political charge, he gained strong popular support for the family through his support for the introduction of a proportional taxing system. Giovanni's son Cosimo the Elder, Pater Patria, took over in 1434 as Grand Maestro, and the Medici became unofficial heads of state of the Florentine Republic. Three successive generations of the Medici, Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo, ruled over Florence through the greater part of the 15th century, without altogether abolishing representative government but clearly dominating it. These three members of the Medici family had great skills in the management of so restive and independent of city as Florence. When Lorenzo died in 1492, however, his son Piero proved quite incapable, and within 2 years he and his supporters were forced into exile and were replaced with a republican government. Piero de' Medici, Cosimo's son, stayed in power for only 5 years. He was called Piero the Gouty because of the gout that afflicted his foot and eventually led to his death. Unlike his father, Piero had little interest in the arts. Due to his illness, he mostly stayed at home bedridden, and therefore did little to further the Medici control of Florence while in power. As such, Medici rule stagnated until the next generation, when Piero's son Lorenzo took over. Piero's illegitimate son, then Ahannio, fled from Italy and lived in the Alps for 15 years. Lorenzo de' Medici, called the Magnificent, was more capable of leading and ruling a city, but he neglected the family banking business, leading to its ultimate ruin. To ensure the continuance of his family's success, Lorenzo planned his children's future careers for them. He groomed the headstrong Piero to follow as his successor in civil leadership. Giovanni was placed in the church at an early age, and his daughter Maddalena was provided with a sumptuous dowry to make a politically advantageous marriage to a son of Pope Innocent VIII. There was a conspiracy in 1478 to depose the family by killing Lorenzo with his younger brother Giuliano during Easter services. The assassination attempt ended with the death of Giuliano and an injured Lorenzo. The conspiracy involved the Pazzi and Salviati families, who were both rival banking families seeking to end the Medici influence, as well as the priest presiding over the church services, the Archbishop of Pisa, and even Pope Sixtus V. IV to a degree. The conspirators approached Sixtus IV in the hopes of gaining his approval, as he and the Medici had a long rivalry themselves, but the Pope gave no official sanction to the plan. Despite his refusal of official approval, the Pope nonetheless allowed the plot to proceed without interfering, and, after the failed assassination of Lorenzo, also gave dispensation for crimes done in the service of the Church. After this, Lorenzo adopted his brother's illegitimate son, Giulio de' Medici, the future Clement VII. Unfortunately, all of Lorenzo's careful planning fell apart to some degree under his incompetent son, Piero II, who took over as the head of Florence after his father's death. Piero was responsible for the expulsion of the Medici from 1494 to 1512. The Medici additionally benefited from the discovery of vast deposits of alum in Tolfa. Alum is essential as a mordant in the dyeing of certain cloths and was used extensively in Florence, where the main industry was textile manufacturing. However, the Turks were the only exporters of alum, so Europe was forced to buy from them until the discovery in the Italian town of Tolfa. Pius II granted the Medici family a monopoly on the mining there, making them the primary producers of alum in Europe. 16th century. The exile of the Medici lasted until 1512, and the senior branch of the family, those descended from Cosimo the Elder, were then able to rule on and off until the assassination of Alessandro de' Medici, 1st Duke of Florence, in 1537. This century-long rule was only interrupted on two occasions, when popular revolts sent the Medici into exile. Power then passed to the junior Medici branch, those descended from Lorenzo the Elder, younger son of Giovanni di Medici, starting with his great-great-grandson Cosimo I the Great. The Medici's rise to power was chronicled in detail by Benedetto Dei. Cosimo and his father started the Medici foundations in banking, manufacturing, including a form of franchises, wealth, art, cultural patronage, and in the papacy that ensured the success for generations. At least half, probably more, of Florence's people were employed by them and the foundational branches in business. However, the Medici remained masters of Italy through the two famous 16th-century popes, Leo X and Clement VII, who were de facto rulers of both Rome and Florence. They were both patrons of the arts, but in the religious field they proved unable to stem the advance of Martin Luther's ideas. Clement VII was the pope during the sack of Rome by Charles V, and later was forced to crown him. Clement frequently changed his alliances between the Empire and France, which eventually led him to marry off his first cousin, twice removed, Catherine de' Medici, to the son of Francis I of France, the future Henry II. This led to the Medici blood being transferred, through Catherine's daughters, to the royal family of Spain through Elizabeth of Valois, and the House of Lorraine through Claude of Valois. The most outstanding figure of the 16th century Medici was Cosimo I, who, coming from relatively modest beginnings in the Mugello, rose to supremacy in the whole of Tuscany, conquering the Florentines' most hated rival Siena and founding the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Cosimo purchased a portion of the island of Elba from the Republic of Genoa and based the Tuscan navy there. He died in 1574, succeeded by his eldest surviving son Francesco, whose inability to produce male heirs led to the succession of his younger brother, Ferdinando, upon his death in 1587. Francesco married Johanna of Austria, and with his consort produced Eleonora de' Medici, Duchess of Mantua, and Marie de' Medici, Queen of France and of Navarre. Through Marie, all succeeding French monarchs are descended from Francesco. Ferdinando eagerly assumed the government of Tuscany. He commanded the draining of the Tuscan marshlands, built a road network in southern Tuscany, and cultivated trade in Leghorn. To augment the Tuscan silk industry, he oversaw the planting of mulberry trees along the major roads. He shifted Tuscany away from Habsburg hegemony by marrying the first non-Habsburg candidate since Alessandro, Christina of Lorraine, a granddaughter of Catherine de' Medici. The Spanish reaction was to construct a citadel on the portion of the island of Elba. To strengthen the new Franco-Tuscan alliance, he married his niece, Marie, to Henry IV of France. Henry explicitly stated that he would defend Tuscany from Spanish aggression, but later reneged, after which Ferdinando was forced to marry his heir, Cosimo, to Maria Maddalena of Austria to assuage Spain. Ferdinando sponsored a Tuscan expedition to the New World with the intention of establishing a Tuscan colony. Despite all of these incentives to economic growth and prosperity, the population of Florence at the dawn of the 17th century was a mere 75,000, far smaller than the other capitals of Italy, Rome, Milan, Venice, Palermo and Naples. Francesco and Ferdinando, due to lax distinction between Medici and Tuscan state property, are thought to have been wealthier than their ancestor, Cosimo de Medici, the founder of the dynasty. The Grand Duke alone had the prerogative to exploit the state's mineral and salt resources, and the fortunes of the Medici were directly tied to the Tuscan economy. 17th century Ferdinando, although no longer a cardinal, exercised much influence at successive conclaves. In 1605, Ferdinando succeeded in getting his candidate, Alessandro de' Medici, elected Pope Leo XI. He died the same month, but his successor, Pope Paul V, was also pro-Medici. Ferdinando's pro-papal foreign policy, however, had drawbacks. Tuscany was overrun with religious orders, not all of whom were obliged to pay taxes. Ferdinando died in 1609, leaving an affluent realm. His inaction in international affairs, however, would have long-reaching consequences down the line. In France, Marie de' Medici was acting as regent for her son, Louis XIII. Louis repudiated her pro-Habsburg policy in 1617. She lived the rest of her life deprived of any political influence. Ferdinando's successor, Cosimo II, reigned for less than 12 years. He married Maria Maddalena of Austria, with whom he had his 8 children, including Margherita de' Medici, Ferdinando II de' Medici, and Anna de' Medici. He is most remembered as the patron of astronomer Galileo Galilei, whose 1610 treatise, Sidereus Nuncius, was dedicated to him. Cosimo died of consumption in 1621. Cosimo's elder son, Ferdinando, was not yet of legal maturity to succeed him. Thus Maria Maddalena and his mother, Christina of Lorraine, acted as regents. The collective regency is known as the Tertici. Maria Maddalena's temperament was analogous to Christina's, and together they aligned Tuscany with the papacy, redoubled the Tuscan clergy, and allowed the heresy trial of Galileo Galilei to occur. Upon the death of the last Duke of Urbino, instead of claiming the duchy for Ferdinando, who was married to the Duke of Urbino's granddaughter and heiress Vittoria della Rovere, they permitted it to be annexed by Pope Urban VIII. In 1626, they banned any Tuscan subject from being educated outside the Grand Duchy, a law later overturned but resurrected by Maria Maddalena's grandson, Cosimo III. Harold Acton, an Anglo-Italian historian, ascribes the decline of Tuscany to the Tertici regency. Grand Duke Ferdinando was obsessed with new technology, and had a variety of hygrometers, barometers, barometers, thermometers, and telescopes installed in the Palazzo Pitti. In 1657, Leopoldo de' Medici, the Grand Duke's youngest brother, established the Accademia del Cimento, organized to attract scientists to Florence from all over Tuscany for mutual study. Tuscany participated in the wars of Castro and inflicted a defeat on the forces of Pope Urban VIII in 1643. The war effort was costly and the treasury so empty because of it that when the Castro mercenaries were paid for, the state could no longer afford to pay interest on government bonds, with the result that the interest rate was lowered by 0.75%. At the time, the economy was so decrepit that barter trade became prevalent in rural marketplaces. Ferdinando died on the 23rd of May 1670, afflicted by apoplexy and dropsy. He was interred in the Basilica of San Lorenzo, the Medici's necropolis. At the time of his death, the population of the Grand Duchy was 730,594. The streets were lined with grass and the buildings on the verge of collapse in Pisa. Ferdinando's marriage to Vittoria della Rovere produced two children, Cosimo III de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and Francesco Maria de' Medici, Duke of Rovere and Montefeltro. Upon Vittoria's death in 1694, her allodial possessions, the duchies of Rovere and Montefeltro, passed to her younger son. 18th century. The fall of the dynasty. Cosimo III married Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, a granddaughter of Henry IV of France and Marie de' Medici, an exceedingly discontented pairing. This union produced three children, notably Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Electress Palatine, and the last Medici and Grand Duke of Tuscany, Gian Gaston de' Medici. Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine, Anna Maria Louise's spouse, successfully requisitioned the dignity Royal Highness for the Grand Duke and his family in 1691. Despite the fact that they had no claim to any kingdom, Cosimo frequently paid the Holy Roman Emperor, his nominal feudal overlord, exorbitant dues, and he sent munitions to the emperor during the Battle of Vienna. The Medici lacked male heirs, and in 1705, the Grand Ducal treasury was virtually bankrupt. The population of Florence declined by 50%. The population of the Grand Duchy as a whole declined by an estimated 40%. Cosimo desperately tried to reach a settlement with the European powers, but Tuscany's legal status was very complicated. The area of the Grand Duchy formerly comprising the Republic of Siena was technically a Spanish fief, while the territory of the old Republic of Florence was thought to be under imperial suzerainty. Upon the death of his first son, Cosimo contemplated restoring the Florentine Republic, either upon Anna Maria Louise's death, or on his own. If he predeceased her, the restoration of the Republic would entail resigning Siena to the Holy Roman Empire, but, regardless, it was vehemently endorsed by his government. Europe largely ignored Cosimo's plan. Only Great Britain and the Dutch Republic gave any credence to it, and the plan ultimately died with Cosimo III in 1723. On the 4th of April 1718, Great Britain, France and the Dutch Republic selected Don Carlos of Spain, the elder child of Elizabeth Farnese and Philip V of Spain, as the Tuscan heir. By 1722, the electress was not even acknowledged as heiress, and Cosimo was reduced to spectator at the conferences for Tuscany's future. On the 25th of October 1723, 6 days before his death, Grand Duke Cosimo disseminated a final proclamation commanding that Tuscany stay independent. Anna Maria Luisa would succeed uninhibited to Tuscany after Gian Gastone, and the Grand Duke reserved the right to choose his successor. However, these portions of his proclamation were completely ignored and he died a few days later. Gian Gastone despised the Electress for engineering his catastrophic marriage to Anna Maria Francisca of Saxe-Lauenburg, while she abhorred her brother's liberal policies. He repealed all of his father's anti-Semitic statutes. Gian Gastone reveled in upsetting her. On the 25th of October 1731, a Spanish detachment occupied Florence on behalf of Don Carlos, who disembarked in Tuscany in December of the same year. The Ruspanti, Gian Gastone's decrepit entourage, loathed the Electress, and she them. Duchess Violante, Gian Gastone's sister-in-law, tried to withdraw the Grand Duke from the Ruspanti sphere of influence by organizing banquets. His conduct at the banquets was less than regal. He often vomited repeatedly into his napkin, belched, and regaled those present with socially inappropriate jokes. Following a sprained ankle in 1731, he remained confined to his bed for the rest of his life. The bed, oft smelling of feces, was occasionally cleaned by Violante. In 1736, following the War of the Polish Succession, Don Carlos was disbarred from Tuscany, and Francis III of Lorraine was made heir in his stead. In January 1737, the Spanish troops withdrew from Tuscany, and were replaced by Austrians. Gian Gastone died on the 9th of July 1737, surrounded by prelates and his sister. Anna Maria Luisa was offered a nominal regency by the Prince-de Cron until the new Grand Duke could peregrinate to Tuscany, but declined. Upon her brother's death, she received all the House of Medici's allodial possessions. Anna Maria Luisa signed the Patto di Famiglia on the 31st of October 1737. In collaboration with the Holy Roman Emperor and Grand Duke Francis of Lorraine, she willed all the personal property of the Medici to the Tuscan state, provided that nothing was ever removed from Florence. The Lorrainers, as the occupying forces were called, were popularly loathed, but the regent, the Prince de Cron, allowed the Electress to live unperturbed in the Pitti. She occupied herself with financing and with overseeing the construction of the Basilica of San Lorenzo, started in 1604 by Ferdinando I Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, costing the state 1,000 crowns per week. She donated much of her fortune to charity, £4,000 a month. On the 19th of February 1743, the Dowager Electress Palatine Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici died, and the Grand Ducal line of the House of Medici died with her. The Florentines grieved her, and she was interred in the crypt that she helped to complete, San Lorenzo. The extinction of the main Medici dynasty and the accession in 1737 of Francis Stephen, Duke of Lorraine and husband of Maria Theresa of Austria, led to Tuscany's temporary inclusion in the territories of the Austrian crown. The line of the Principi di Artigiano, an extant branch of the House of Medici who were eligible to inherit the Grand Duchy of Tuscany when the last male of the senior branch died in 1737, could have carried on as Medici sovereigns but for the intervention of Europe's major powers, which allocated the sovereignty of Florence elsewhere. As a consequence, the duchy expired and the territory became a secundogeniture of the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. The first Grand Duke of the new dynasty, Francis I, was a great-great-great-grandson of Francesco I de' Medici, thus continuing the Medici dynasty on the throne of Tuscany through the female line. The Habsburgs were deposed for the Bourbon Parma in 1801, and restored at the Congress of Vienna. Tuscany became a province of the United Kingdom of Italy in 1861. However, Several extant branches of the House of Medici currently continue to exist, including the Princes of Ottajano, the Medici Tornaquinci, and the Verona Medici Counts of Caprara and Gavardo.